Today we're going to discuss urbanization, immigration, and the industrial identity in the late 19th century America. We have been talking a lot about the emergence of business and economic growth that occurred in America post Civil War. But one of the things that is an interesting component of this growth is the actual physical change that the country underwent. And that is, historically, we had been an agricultural nation. The United States had not had a rich history in cities. In fact, the largest city population in the 18th century was 300,000 in Philadelphia. This paled in comparison to European cities of London or Amsterdam or Paris. But as America's economy expanded and we went full force into the industrial age and became leaders of that age, a lot of these concepts that we've talked about in the previous weeks fill in the gaps here. As this growth occurred, people moved. People moved from the countryside, from the city, from different regions and different ethnic backgrounds began to immigrate into these fast growing cities that were going to be highlighted by steel construction. So, what we're going to try to do today is discuss this growth, this urbanization, and we're going to start with some very simple questions about the physical formation of the American city. As we're looking at urbanization, I want us to think of three questions. What innovations contributed to the physical growth of cities? How did the American city reflect the emergent identity as an industrial power? And how did the American skyscraper and office buildings develop from their function? This is an intriguing question that you probably won't be able to just Google, but we're going to be talking about Louis Sullivan's influence in architecture in this age and some of those principles, how they characterize the American city. But as we continue on, again, America was a fast changing place in the late 1800s. As factories formed, people moved from the countryside to the city looking for economic opportunity. And as these cities were being built, they were characterized by these large skyscrapers, these built of steel, right? These modern industrial cities that were much different in their look and feel from other cities throughout the world, like a Paris, like a London, and like an Amsterdam. One of the things is that just look at the population figures during this time. New York City's population in 1880 was 1.2 million. It tripled over the next 20 years and grows to 5.6 million in 1920, a 365 or 66% increase. Chicago at the time had 500,000 people in 1880, but it would triple over the next 20 years and grow to 2.7 million by 1920. But you also see some other things emergent. That is, the city of Baltimore, a port city, growing significantly during this time. You get cities now on the western coast, and you'll even have more and more cities start to pop up throughout the South, from Atlanta to St. Louis. Looking at the chart does tell us about how fast the population was growing at this time and the pressures that this would place on society. If we were just to consider Greenville's population, which is about 92,000, in 1990, Greenville, North Carolina had somewhere of 40,000 citizens. So if you think about, in some ways, Greenville's population has over doubled in the last 30 years. Now, this is if you think about the pressures that places on our highways, our infrastructure, the need for these additions that we're seeing in the bypass. The American city truly did undergo some impressive growth during this period. And while this may seem mundane, just calculating the statistics of the population, I do think it gives us some insight into the changes that were occurring and some of the issues that were newly arising in America. Now, let's move on to our first question. What innovations contributed to the physical growth of cities? And one of the things that's different about American cities is that sometimes they can feel very consolidated. The American city was able to grow up in a time where certain technological features were helping characterize the development of that city. So, for instance, the Otis elevator, which was introduced in the 1850s, but would be prevalent throughout the 1870s and 80s, gave the American building the ability to grow up. And when I say up, I mean vertically. One of the things to think about here is that buildings prior to the innovation of steel really could only be limited to about 4 stories without some very impressive architectural designs. So maybe you see buildings throughout the world like a cathedral that is that is higher than 4 stories. But the general building that was built of masonry stone, the typical construction could only handle about 4 stories up. On top of that, if you don't have an ability to move up and down easily, rarely do you want to build higher than that. But the elevator gives us the opportunity to build beyond that and make it a functional design.
If it were not for this technology and his invention, there would be no high-rise structures or skyscrapers. Who was he? This business legend is brought to you by Elijah Otis changed the world by inventing the first safety elevator in 1852. Prior to this time, hoists had a serious fault of falling to the bottom should the lifting cable break. Mr. Otis invented an automatic safety device to prevent the car from falling. To demonstrate his new invention, he had himself hoisted to the ceiling in front of a large crowd, then ordered the cables cut. The platform held fast and the elevator industry was born. After Elijah's death, his sons Charles and Norton Otis continued to build the company. By 1873, there were over 2,000 Otis elevators in service. As the world urbanized and the age of high-rise structures and skyscrapers followed, Otis elevators continued to grow and prosper. Today, Otis is still the largest elevator company in the world with 1.2 million units in service and annual sales approaching $6 billion. Elijah Otis, a business legend.
The real change, though, that comes about is the emergence of Bessemer steel, which we have learned about in this course, and the ability not only to mass manufacture steel, but produce a high-grade steel in a standardized way that allows for the building of these giant skyscrapers. So one of the things, if you see, is that it's the I-beam, the steel I-beam, that gives architects and the ability to build up, and it is the elevator that makes it functional to build up. And so when you start to look at some of the characteristics of the American city, you want to think of the tall office building made of steel. And if we look at the toys of the time, the erector set was a toy that came about, and sometimes small things in life can tell us about the attitude and temperature of a society. The erector set was first introduced and sold to the public in 1913 at the toy fair held at the Broadway Central Hotel in New York City. Erector was first envisioned by Alfred Gilbert in 1911, and he was a commuter. He was riding the train from New Haven, Connecticut to New York City, and looking outside as he saw these buildings being built, he saw that steel I-frame construction, and he modeled a toy that could apply the same principles. So even kids in the American industrial age were being raised and steeped in these attitudes about industrialization. Boys today, men tomorrow.
Today, you'd walk past it without a thought. But the Monadnock building in downtown Chicago literally marks the transition from one era of architecture to another. The half on the northern side was built of masonry. In the south-facing half, however, the weight was carried by a steel frame. This allowed narrower walls and, above all, greater height. One of the great architects of the era was Louis Sullivan. For him, the skyscraper was nothing less than a new art form.
It must be tall, every inch of it tall. The force and power of altitude must be in it. It must be every inch a proud and soaring thing.
But although the new commercial style of architecture had its roots in the Midwest, it blossomed in New York. And so, in America's corporate capital, the country's biggest businessmen vied to produce the world's greatest building. The Woolworth Building, headquarters of the vast retail empire located on Broadway opposite City Hall. When the plans were unveiled in 1910, there were many critics. One engineering journal complained,
"There is no excuse for the rearing of this great pile, shutting off the light of its neighbors, darkening the streets, and containing a population of several thousand people."
The explanation was quite simply the ego of Frank Woolworth. He kept increasing the number of stories on the building. Eventually, Cass Gilbert, his architect, asked,
"How high do you want the tower now?"
How high can you make it?
"It's for you to make the limit."
Then make it 50 feet higher than the Metropolitan Tower.
Woolworth had the rivals surreptitiously measured just to make sure. His HQ was indeed the world's tallest building for 17 years, until 1930.
Now, the real one, if we were going to try to find a tone or the philosophy behind the American city, a good place to look is Louis Sullivan. Louis Sullivan was an architect who worked heavily in Chicago. The Chicago experienced a tremendous fire in the 1870s, and it was in the ashes of that fire that they began to rebuild. And Chicago took on a really innovative style for the American city, because the destruction of the Great Fire essentially gave them a sandbox or a playground to build with steel. And so you will see steel buildings, steel framed buildings become prevalent in the Chicago skyline. Louis Sullivan actually got his start working on the last masonry building that would be constructed in Chicago. It was called the Chicago Auditorium. And if you look at this building, you can see some of the concepts that I alluded to earlier. First is that it's there's a limit on the size. While they're able to build this bell tower in the back, there's obviously this limitation in the size, and really the strength comes in the walls themselves. So that's why you see very small windows. You see the arches punctuating a lot of this. Right? And it really looks to embrace some of the old techniques of architecture. Right? When you look at, for instance, when I was in Florence and you go to the Duomo, it's that these masonry buildings, they are impressive, they're ornate, but there are also some limitations structurally to them, right? So Louis Sullivan, what he started to do is work on skyscrapers and office buildings. Here's one from St. Louis. Here is the Carson Peary and Scott department store, a Chicago of 1899. And this, you can truly see a lot of the concepts behind Louis Sullivan's style in the Chicago School of Architecture. Louis Sullivan published a article known as the Tall Office Building Reconsidered. And it's in this article. You can find the title for that on our outline. Right here, it is the first term in the second column, the Tall Office Building Artistically Considered. And it's in this work that Sullivan really works through or explores some of the ideas that we find so prevalent in the American office building or skyscraper. And what he said is that in every object, the form of that object follows its function. So if you want a chair, it should be functional to sit in. It should not be made of materials that hurt you when you sit. He says that you can find this in all aspects of life. And one way I like to think of this is when my kids were into dinosaurs as when they were little children. And one of the first things you teach or learn about dinosaurs is that some are carnivores, some are herbivores, and some are omnivores. And one way that archaeologists are able to tell if an animal was a herbivore or a carnivore was the shape of their teeth. Think of a tiger, right? Or a T-Rex with those sharp teeth that are able to tear at meat, right? But then if you look at an animal that eats plant-based foods, maybe like an elephant or is that these often they have these flat teeth that are made for grinding material. So the form of your teeth actually takes shape based on its function. So think your front teeth are sharp to bite and tear, and your back teeth are made to mash. The form of that tooth follows its function. And it's this concept that Lewis applies to the design of American skyscrapers. As he said this, is there's no sense in these buildings being remarkably complicated at the top where they should, because what are these going to be? They are going to be an office building. This is a good example of this. Let's look at the Carson Scott department store. Is that this in the bottom right corner is where all the attraction, where the real money is invested in style and time, because these are going to be storefronts. You want this to be inviting. People are going to be walking down the street. They're going to want a window shop. You want them to come on in into this very welcoming entrance right here that is that's luring you in as a consumer. In the middle section right here, in the meat of the building, right? People don't want to shop on the fourth floor, right? So what would you maybe put on the third and fourth floor? You maybe put lawyer offices or some sort of garment factory, right? Where you have the elevators, the freight elevators going up there. And where do you hide the electrical equipment, whether it comes to the air conditioning or whatever motors that are going to be running the elevator? You certainly don't want that on the bottom or taking up space in the middle. So you put that in the least functional part of the building, the top, right? So the American office building, its form followed its function, and its form took shape because the function was industry, business, and economic development. So when you look at this in comparison, if we were to look at the comparison of the American city and skyline versus other cities, it seems like you can almost gather an identity about a place. I just came back from Florence, and the city has this great old character to it but it doesn't scream business and industry. It screams Renaissance to you because that's the cultural identity of Florence. Or we think to London and the features of government related to Big Ben, right? Or you think of Rome. Rome's another great example here, is that old antiquity of Roman architecture characterized by that of the Vatican. It really tells us the identity of these places, the cultural legacy attached to the architecture. But if we look at the American business, look at Chicago in 1910. This screams industry and business. You look at Manhattan too, packed in, these very industrial, high-powered financial center of the world that is growing. We can see that the American city's form followed its function, and the function of the city was industrial production in the late 19th century.